Hello and welcome. What we're going to be looking at in this slide is we're going to be looking at poetry and personas, and what we're looking at in particular is we're going to look at how main characters, or basically the persona that the poet uses, is represented through a poem and what importance it has to the meaning and the effect of a poem. Now, even though a lot of poetry is significant to the poet who wrote it, and often they are very personal poems about events in their own life, what you've got to consider is that poetry is still fictional, and we'll go through that in a moment. And so we must look at the characters within as personas, particularly if we're talking from one person's perspective, as we often are. And this is because poetry isn't a biography. It is, and often it is fictionalized. It's told through metaphor and those sorts of things. And by saying it's a direct relationship between the poet and whoever's the speaker in the story, or the persona, we would get the sensation that they would be exactly the same thing, whereas in some cases they are not. They are fictionalized. They often create these different people who sort of have a similar voice to what they do and share a similar sort of set of beliefs and values that they do, but at the same time are not them, and we can't really say that it is them. So it may seem like a very small point, but it is quite significant when you're looking at what is a persona and what is a poet. Okay, so the persona is what they create. However, you can still look at the poet's role. Wouldn't look at it in a way that you completely dismiss the poet's role in the poetry. They do shape the persona, and certainly if you do the research required to interpret poetry well, you'll often find that you'll have an understanding of what the poet's mood and role is, and the kind of person a poet is often influences their persona and often influences the kind of poetry that's being written. So you can certainly look at the poet's role, you just won't refer to them as being the poet. So that's what you're looking for, particularly when you're dealing with very personal poetry, and a lot of very famous poets and a lot of the poetry that you'll probably end up studying is very personal and often very sort of entwined, I guess, with the self and with the person who wrote it. And so if you're looking at poetry in terms of its relationship with the poet, you've got to also assume that they're a little bit distant as well. Okay, so let's look at who the persona actually is. Now, the persona is someone who you're going to be looking at as a character within the poem, but who is actually, what are we actually referring to? Well, really what we're referring to is the speaker. And it's the person whose voice we hear as we're reading the poem. Now, when you're comparing this to other forms of text, and certainly you're looking at things like novels where there is normally a sort of speaker as well, poetry is different in the regard that it generally focuses on being lyrical, and it's focused on, I guess, telling someone's perspective. Now, this is also true of novels and extended forms of literature as well, but it doesn't quite have the same sort of level of effect as it does in a poem. The same as if you're looking at, for instance, the title of the poem being important, whereas in a longer form of literature, while the title is still important, it is not quite as important because of the way that the text is laid out. But also in the case of poetry, because it often does represent someone's point of view and someone's perspective, and because the tone is usually very much defined in a short sort of space, then what we get is we get a sort of a character that develops itself. And in many cases, when we don't really get given a character, the speaker forms that character that we get, and certainly the way that they look through things. Now, obviously, as I mentioned before, this speaker isn't the poet. The speaker is constructed by the poet. It may almost be the poet's entirely their voice. But in terms of what we're referring to them as basically being a character, and their perspectives come across as the poet's perspective does. We also look at poetry written through a mouthpiece as rather than being a standalone piece of text, as mentioned before. And we do this in a way because we look at poetry as something which is in many cases lyrical, so like a song, but also because we look at poetry as something where someone is trying to convey a point of view, an idea. And a text is more about telling a story. And while some poetry, again, also tells a story, and there's various forms of narrative poetry, the vast majority of poetry that you'll be looking at won't be so much telling a story as will be telling a point of view, a feeling, an emotion, and expressing it in such a way. And this is why this characterization, again, is quite important. And this is also why we look at their tone and perspective and how they contribute to the value and the meaning of the text. And that's really what we're referring to when we're talking about the persona being significant. All right, so let's look at the meaning and what does this mean? Okay, well, because a poem is essentially a world seen through someone else's eyes, and particularly in the case of a poet, or as we're looking at a persona, we're really looking at someone else's worldview. So it's pretty much an exercise in empathy, as in you're looking at the world through someone else's eyes. And when you're looking at poetry in depth, yes, it will communicate views of the poet, and certainly it will reflect the poet's own view of the world. However, the persona is just an extension of them. It's almost like a ghost of them, which also projects that sort of idea as well. And so anything that the poet is trying to express, you're attaching it to the persona. And the poet is still somewhere in the background, but they're not being referred to directly. By developing this persona's viewpoint, we basically interpret their way of looking at the world. And we see how it is shaped as well according to their values. Now, what that means is through the way that a poet speaks through the persona that's constructed and through the language of that poem, we can attribute that to basically the persona. And the persona is saying these things. The persona is talking about the world in their own way. And as we attribute those statements to them, we learn more about them. We learn more about how they look at things. And so when we are looking at their viewpoint, we sort of, as we're discussing their viewpoint, we're connecting ideas of emotion to that person and to their tone and to their mood. And what they're presenting is a look at the world. Now, as I mentioned before, this is often reflective of the worldview of the poet. And certainly you can't discount that. So by doing research into the background of the poet, there are certain things you can attach to that. And basically, you're almost admitting the poet in this case is creating a persona in order to represent their own ideas. That's what we're looking at. Okay, so now that we've looked at what the value a persona has, how do we discuss it? How do we talk about the meaning that this generates? Okay, so we know already that basically, and as I've been saying before, a poet creates a persona so they are able to get their point across. So they're able to write a poem that generates and presents their worldview to their readers, to their audience. And what we're looking at here is we're looking at basically the sorts of language techniques, the sorts of themes and ideas which you would then attach to the persona. And as the poem is still a form of storytelling, their characterization and basically them as a character. So when you look at emotional language and motifs, for instance, and its connection with persona, as well as the idea of theme, what you're really looking at is that basically through this persona, through this character telling a story about themselves and about their feelings and their way of looking at the world, everything that they raise is something that attaches to them. And any object, particularly things like motifs, where you're looking at things like symbols, refer to something that's important to the persona. And you would describe it in terms of the persona's value rather than necessarily the poet's. Now, whether or not it has a value to a poet or not is really irrelevant in this case, because what we're looking at is we're looking at how this persona starts to tell a story using these objects, using these emotions, and how they're able to create themes using all those things put together. Emotional statements also generally reflect the emotional state and views of the persona. So when they do make sweeping emotional statements, it's really trying to express the way that they look at the world and the way that they try and put their own worldview forward. And certainly when you're looking at the way that this is represented for a lot of poetry, and you consider how poets often try and convey their ideas. Now, they're not necessarily conveying to an audience or to a reader, but because of the fact that they do write poetry and that person who they become in their poetry really stands out, these emotional statements do come across in the method of storytelling, and there's something you look at in isolation. So when you're discussing it, you'll talk about obviously the themes, the motifs, and the emotional statements and language which is used, and you'll then link it to how they think. The same as with the theme. The theme is basically whatever the main idea of the poem is. So again, that is attributed to the persona and their storytelling, to what they're trying to tell us, to tell whoever is reading it. So let's look at an example, because I know this might sound a bit confusing, and certainly it may also seem like I'm repeating myself a little bit, but really what I'm trying to reinforce is that the ideas that you're looking at in representing a persona and how a persona is represented is really looking at how ideas are created and who is telling you these things, who is the speaker and who is communicating all of these ideas in poetry. And this is really what the value of the persona is. And in this case, we've got an excerpt from Edgar Allan Poe's a poem, A Dream Within a Dream. And we see in this one the persona's tone and mood, and it's quite clearly present even in this short statement, which is, yet if hope has flown away in a night or in a day, or in a vision or in none, is it therefore the less gone? And what this is representing is, obviously, when you look at it in terms of interpreting its mood to start with, you're speaking to a persona, or you're listening to a persona, should I say, who is depressed, who is sad, and is looking at the world through a very forlorn sort of gaze. And it is representing a persona who is basically, whose hope is gone. We're looking at a man who pities he's passing through life and starts to liken it to a dream. And that he's almost looking at dreams and reality as being one of the same thing. And when hope is lost in his dreams, he feels almost so defeated that he's not able to distance that from reality, and that whatever he's feeling, it's haunting him. It's continuing to come after him over and over again. And so when you've got this sort of statement, where you've got in a night, in a day, or in a vision, or in none, you've basically got that parallel between dreams and reality being represented at once. And so the persona's perspective is really important in that, because it really does represent the kinds of, basically the way he's looking at the world right now, which is that his dreams, and certainly this also is suggested by the title, that his dreams of hopelessness and all these things in life that are failing him in his dreams and are failing him in reality, it feels like his life is slipping away, and that the two ideas are almost exactly the same. As basically a dream fades away, his life seems to be fading away as well. So all these things are almost blended in together as if they're one. And persona's tone represents a characterization that values hope, and we still see a sort of sense of value for hope as well. It's not completely lost. However, through the tone of the poem, we can interpret the fact that while this person values having hope, he's lost it. He's completely beyond hope, and certainly beyond feeling hope. And basically, due to these circumstances, due to whatever is going on in his life, this hope is gone. This hope is lost. And this is where the persona is really important, because if we look at those ideas in isolation, we sort of get a bit of philosophy, but nothing really significant. And while you may argue, well, we don't really know who this person is, why does having a person make it more, or a persona in this regard, make it more significant? Is because it becomes someone's experience and becomes a way of looking at the world, which is basically you start to feel this person's mood, this person's sorrow, all of these different things. And by connecting it to the persona and what this persona is trying to tell us and trying to tell the world, is almost like a cry for help. And certainly it's not a philosophical statement as much as it is a cry for help. And that's where this statement comes in. And certainly this is where the poem gets value through what the persona is able to construct. So going back full circle, what we get is the persona creating meaning by telling the world, almost telling us, the reader, these feelings, these ways and perspectives of looking at the world as a way of being able to express themselves, as yes, all poetry is, but also as a way to express a cry for help, and to express that life is slipping away, and that these dreams and these nightmares indeed are starting to take over his life. So really, that is the main point of looking at persona, is looking at how these sort of viewpoints are generated and how they construct and ultimately develop meaning and the value of the poem as well. And when we look back at the poet, we can see, yes, a lot of persona in the poet, and we can see a lot of his body of work being influencing the poem. But at the same time, we still got to look at it in isolation, because of the fact that we are really just looking at the one poem, and we're not necessarily looking at the man in this case. Just the same as when you look at a painting, you're not looking at the artist and them in their studio painting it and saying this means this. So really, it also values your own input and values your own interpretation, and that's one of the good things about it, is that you're able to pursue it in a number of different ways. So that is the value of the persona, and that's basically all there is for this lesson. So until next time, I'll see you later.